I am going to trip over that at least once.
No, please don't.
It'll be funny.
Well, welcome everyone to our, what we've determined now is our final lecture of the series. We could have gone into April, but nobody from the Institute of Island Studies is going to be here in April, so we thought, well, probably this is a good place to end with our Jocelyn Plourde here tonight. I'll just say, I'm Laurie Brinklow. I am the coordinator of the Institute of Island Studies, which is a research, public policy, and education institute. Right down the hallway is where our offices are. The washrooms, if you keep going past our offices, you'll find the washrooms there and a water fountain. And come on in, hi, welcome. And there we also have the Master of Arts in Island Studies program, which we'll hear a little bit more about shortly from Joss, I'm sure, as he is a graduate, a newly minted graduate of the program. We have a couple of our Institute of Island Studies board members here, Carolyn Peach-Brown, who is also one of Joss's supervisors. This is Carolyn here, an executive member. We have Jean-Paul Arsenault, who's a member of our advisory board. We've had Georges Arsenault, who has been a member of our board in the past and a lecturer here. It's so wonderful to see so many faces, familiar as well as new, here tonight. So, the other thing that we have is the UNESCO Chair in Island Studies and Sustainability, and the co-chair of that is Jim Randall. So I'll ask Jim to come up and say a few words, please.
Sure, Laurie, and thanks. Just wanted to say a couple of words. One, first of all, I'm proud of Joss, graduate of the program. Good for you. Good spokesperson for the program, of course. We have done something a little bit different this past year with the program. Joss graduated from the thesis-based program. The thesis-based program has been around probably for about 16 years now. And this past year we started a course and work study based version of the program. For those students who wanted to have something that was a little bit more applied and they didn't necessarily have a passion for one specific research project. We started this past year with a specialization in island tourism. And this coming year we'll have another cohort in island tourism and a new cohort in sustainable island communities. And I say that because it sort of is a little bit more aligned with some of the things that Joss will be talking about tonight. We pride ourselves both at the Institute and the Master's program in trying to bridge the global and the local. So we've done a lot over the past 30 years in the Institute to try to bring the university closer to the community. And we also have done many things historically and recently at an international level. And we believe that there are lessons that we can show the world of things that we're doing well. But then also there are things that are happening elsewhere in the world, like in Samso, that we can learn from as well. And so there's a good mix of that local and global that we believe that islanders enjoy hearing about and contributing to. So I'm going to stop right there and turn it back to Laurie to introduce Joss. And I will say, however, that I do have a sign-up sheet. Most of you are probably on this already. If you're not on it, this gets you onto our list. And if there are upcoming events, we'll be sending out newsletters usually once every few weeks to let you know of those upcoming events, like lectures like this. So I'll pass this around. If you want to give your email address, we promise not to use it needlessly.
Or sell it to the highest bidder. So tonight, as you know, we have Jocelyn Plourde, who has lived in PEI for more than a decade. He lives in Charlottetown and teaches high school math and science at École La Belle Cloche in Rollo Bay. Jocelyn obtained his degrees in sciences and in education at the University of Ottawa. His thesis, titled From Policy to Action, Renewable Energy in Samsø, Denmark, was written as part of his UPEI Master of Arts in Island Studies program, which he completed in June of 2008. And before I turn it over to Joss, I wrote up here in the top, cell phones, because I always forget to remind people to turn off or turn down your cell phone, and invariably it rings. So I am actually very proud that I remembered. So
You know, like swear jars?
yeah,
We should have like a cell phone jar, like when people like have their phones ring, they pay.
are you a teacher? Take it away, Joss.
Thank you. And you just saved me a slide because I had an introduction slide, but now I don't have to do it. Yay!
Okay.
So, thank you all for being here. I would be lying if I said that I wasn't nervous, because I was like, that, 10, maybe 12 people. Now there's all these people. This is the title of my thesis, as well as the title of my presentation. I was going to introduce myself, but I really don't have anything to add other than what she just said. So, yeah, moving on. So, the subject of my thesis is basically a case study of a small Danish island called Samsø. This is it right here in the middle of Denmark, and it's about this, it looks like that in bigger size. It's about 30-35 kilometers tip to tip. Samsø is known around the world as the Renewable Energy Island. And the reason for that is that from 1997 to 2007, the island transitioned away from fossil fuels and to renewable energy. When I learned about it, I learned about this as I was considering what subject to do for my thesis, and when I came across this, I started to do more reading and some videos, and I really loved the idea of doing a case study of this island and learning how they did their transition. To guide my work, I created 3 different research questions. The first being, what were the governmental policies that were in place at the time in Denmark that encouraged renewable energy development? Second was to basically find out how the transition happened. So what happened from 1997 to 2007? How did they implement their transition? And then finally, to take those the answers from those 2 questions and to make a link. What's the connection between public policy and the actual development of renewable energy? Those are my 3 research questions. In terms of the purpose, the significance of this research, well, I always wanted to do something, when I got into this program, I wanted to do something that would be practical, that I could hopefully share with policymakers that would be useful. And essentially, if we are to address climate change, one of the things we have to do is we have to change the way that we make energy. So for me, being passionate about the issue of climate change, this seemed like a good direction to go. Now, in my experience, I've been talking about environmental issues for a while, including publicly, and in my experience, climate change is one of those issues that everyone's heard about, but not everyone really understands. So I'm going to give you a Coles Notes short version, of climate change. Do Coles Notes still exist? That's the little thing. No, I was asking myself that as I was practicing. So for those of you that are well versed in the science of climate change, just take a nap. For those of you that are not, I'll hopefully make this as simple and easy to understand as possible. So if we're going to talk about climate change, we have to talk about the atmosphere. Most of you probably remember something like this from your science textbooks in high school or grade school. So these are the gases that are present in the atmosphere. So most of the air that we breathe is actually nitrogen, 78%. 21% is oxygen, which we actually use, and then there's 1% of a bunch of other gases. Within that 1% is carbon dioxide. So 0.4% of our atmosphere is carbon dioxide. But what's special about carbon dioxide is that it's a greenhouse gas. And there's a reason we call it that. Can anyone explain why it's always hot when you walk into a greenhouse? Anybody? Come on, don't be shy. I'm a teacher, so I do this all the time.
Short wave or long wave radiation.
Not that fancy.
Sun going through it and
The heat doesn't
heat
get
doesn't get.
Exactly, right? So it's made of clear material, so the sunlight goes in, the sunlight heats up what's inside, and the heat wants to radiate out, but it can't get out because there's panels all over the place, so you walk in, it's nice and warm. Carbon dioxide does the same thing, but on a planetary scale. Sunlight can pass through the atmosphere, warms up the earth, warms up the oceans, that heat is radiated out. It would normally radiate out into space, but carbon dioxide keeps it near the surface. So think of carbon dioxide like a really big blanket that covers the earth and keeps us warm. Now that's a good thing. Average temperature on the planet is 15 degrees Celsius. That's an average of the entire planet. You take away the greenhouse effect and it's minus 18, which would suck. All the water would be frozen and none of us would be here and I wouldn't be talking to you today. So the greenhouse effect is important. It's part of the reason why there's life on Earth. But you can't have too much of a good thing. And since the the early 1800s, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we've been adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. When we burn coal, natural gas, oil for producing electricity, we emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. When we drive our cars, ride our boats, planes, trains that run on gasoline and diesel, we emit carbon dioxide. Even when we clear out forests, some of the carbon in those trees, in those plants, is released out as carbon dioxide. And all that stuff builds up in the atmosphere. We add, like we as in the entire planet, in all the human activity, we add about 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere each year, which is a really big number that doesn't really mean much. What's more useful is to talk about concentration. So I still remember, because I'm that old, in my textbooks when I was in school, they always talked about 300 parts per million, or 0.03% of the atmosphere was carbon dioxide. So that was the concentration before the Industrial Revolution. I checked this weekend, we're at 411 parts per million, which means that we've increased the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere by 47%. This is I love this graph. I find it really interesting because I love graphs. This is a graph of the concentration of CO2, and this is time, but it's time backwards. So this is today, and this is 400,000 years ago. So in the past 400,000 years, carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere have not gone over 300 ppm since we showed up. Interestingly, we weren't even around until around this time, which is kind of neat. So essentially, what all this means is our blanket's gotten thicker. Right? That big blanket around the planet, it's gotten thicker. And as a result, the planet's gotten warmer. Another graph from NASA, which just shows temperature change over time. And if you look at the tail end, what's interesting is the 5 hottest years on record, this is recorded history that we've been keeping track of temperatures. And the 5 hottest years in history are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the last 5 years. So the planet is warming, and we know it's because of concentrations of CO2. What it's doing to our planet is what we call climate change. One of the first things that is most evident, especially for people who live on an island like us, is sea level rise. So as the atmosphere gets warmer, a lot of that heat gets sucked into the atmosphere. And what that causes is thermal expansion, which is a fancy way of saying when something gets hot, it expands. So when all the water in the atmosphere, in the ocean gets warmer, it expands and sea level rises. So 3.17 millimeters per year doesn't sound like a lot. The problem is that's accelerating. And as we start seeing the ice shelves over Greenland and over Antarctica start to melt, they're going to start dumping their water into the ocean, and this number is going to increase. And sea levels are going to rise, and they're going to continue to rise for a long time. In addition, as the planet is getting warmer, we're seeing more and more heat waves. We're seeing a lot more record heat temperatures. Heat waves are getting longer. And note that I'm saying they are. This is not something that's going to happen in 50 years. This is already happening now. As it gets warmer, there's more evaporation, there's more drought. Droughts are becoming more frequent, and they're lasting longer. Forest fires are also happening more. We're seeing forest fire seasons stretching out. They're burning more forests. And ironically, as some parts of the world are getting drier, other parts are getting wetter. As there's more evaporation, there's more moisture going into the atmosphere. And as the planet gets warmer, basically our clouds are able to hold more water. So as the expression says, when it rains, it pours. So we're seeing more extreme rainfall, we're seeing more flooding, but we're also, ironically, also seeing more heavy snowfalls because there's more moisture in the atmosphere. So our climate is changing because the planet is warming. And the planet is warming because we're adding CO2 to the atmosphere. So if we want to address climate change, we have to reduce how much CO2 we're putting in the atmosphere. That's what's called mitigation. So when we talk about, if you ever hear someone talk about the mitigation of climate change, that's another way of saying we need to reduce our emissions of carbon dioxide. And we have to do it drastically, and we have to do it now. Well, technically, we should have started 20, 30 years ago, but now is better than later. So, warming to date is about 0.8 degrees, between 0.8 and 1 degree Celsius. That's how much the planet has warmed compared to pre-industrial levels. If you follow the news, you probably have heard of the 2-degree target. Essentially, we've all agreed, all the nations of the world have pretty much agreed, we have to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. The problem is, we set that target in the early 1990s, and our understanding of climate change has continued to improve as time goes on. And what the scientific community has realized is that 2 degrees Celsius is a problem on two fronts. First, it's too much. From our understanding of the climate impacts of 2 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees is now basically a kind of a border between dangerous climate change and catastrophic climate change. And that sounds hyperbolic, but it's really based on what we're expecting to see. We're expecting to see serious losses of life, especially in the poorest parts of the world. We're probably going to see a lot of migration, a lot of what they call climate refugees, people that have to leave their homes because they can't live where they used to live, they can't grow food anymore, sea levels flooded it, and a lot of other factors, and that has a lot of knock-on effects like political instability, warfare. And 2 degrees is bad, but 2 degrees is better than 3, which is better than 4 or 5 or 6. So this is our target, and we want to meet that. The problem is we're running out of time. Much smarter people than me have done the math. They know how much CO2 we can put in the atmosphere before we tip over 2 degrees Celsius, and at the rate at which we're emitting, we have 12 years, which means if we keep emitting CO2 the way we're doing it right now, in 12 years we will have locked in 2 degrees Celsius no matter what. So we need to act. Now that's the bad news. The good news is we have all the technology we need, we have all the know-how that we need, we have everything that we need to address this problem. Mitigation can be done. There's no magic, there's no silver bullet, there's no magic technology waiting for us to be invented, there is no dietary supplement that will help you lose 12 pounds in a week. But it will take a lot of effort in a lot of different fronts. We have to look at how we eat, we have to look at how we travel, we have to look at our buildings, and we have to look at how we make energy. Now obviously I can't talk about all those things in one thesis, so I decided to focus on renewable energy. Specifically, what's the link between public policy and renewable energy systems? You're going to hear me use this a lot, renewable energy systems. It's just another way of saying solar panels and wind turbines and things of that sort. So, we're going to be talking about public policy, but I'd like to know, can someone tell me what they think public policy means? Because we hear that a lot, right? Public policy, policy, policy. What does that mean?
Laws and regulations.
Yeah. Anybody else? Do I have to start handing out candy for good answers? I teach high school, I don't do that. Yeah, basically public policies are the rules, the regulations, the decisions that government makes, hopefully usually on our behalf. Yeah, that's it. And when it comes to renewable energy, there is a necessity for good public policy to support the development of renewable energy. Now some of you, although I don't know if you would have come to this presentation, but some of you may think, well, we should let the free market decide what kind of energy systems we need. Sorry, but you're wrong. There are two major reasons why we need good public policy when it comes to renewables. The first is the need, right? We talked about climate change, we need to reduce our emissions. So there's that pressure that we need to act. The other necessity is actual obstacles to the deployment of renewable energy. And the obstacles aren't because there's something wrong with renewables, it's actually more like issues with our system. The first obstacle is what people call market forces and our natural human, what's the word that I'm looking for? Habit of focusing on initial cost. Look, when we talk about market forces, the free hand of the market, all those things, there's always a focus on short-term economic gain. Can a company make more money this quarter than it did last quarter? And we see that in our day-to-day lives with this focus on initial cost. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're shopping for a car, and you're looking at a Honda Civic, starting at $18,000. 4 doors, fuel efficient, pretty red color. Then your environmentally friendly friend says, well, have you looked at the Tesla Model 3? And you're like, are you insane? That's a $41,000 car. Okay, but that's the short-term cost, right? If you look at the lifetime of the car, if you look at the cost of the car, gasoline, maintenance, as time goes on, those prices become very, very, very similar. Because gasoline costs, sorry, that's not true. To get a Honda Civic moving 100 kilometers will cost you 4 times the cost that it takes to move an electric car 100 kilometers. Electric cars don't have spark plugs, they don't have oil changes, they don't have mufflers, so maintenance is simpler. So yes, it costs more up front, but in the long term. But that's not how we're wired to think. Shoes, we do the same thing. Clothing, we do the same thing. If we didn't, Walmart wouldn't exist. Houses, governments, and buildings. I'm in a new school, which I love, but it's obvious that we were focused on short-term spending. And we have the same problem when it comes to energy, right? If a community needs a certain amount of electricity, and it's considering a coal-fired plant, or I should say, a coal-fired plant and an offshore wind farm, which one's going to cost less to build? The coal. It's not even close. But wind is free. You have to pay for coal, right? So over the long term, again, the prices have become very similar, or actually even much cheaper when it comes to wind. And that's before you consider the environmental issues associated with coal. So that's a market force that's pushing against renewables. The other one is subsidies. If I had $1 every time I heard someone complain about subsidies for renewables, the reality is fossil fuels get a lot of money. This was a 2011 number, so it's probably a higher number now. $523 billion a year in subsidies to fossil fuels. That's 6 times what renewables get. That's worldwide. And this is a number from the International Energy Agency. It's not the David Suzuki Foundation, right? So this is a realistic value. I have nothing against the David Suzuki Foundation. That's not what I was trying to say. And that's just direct subsidies from governments. If you take into account the externalities associated with the burning of fossil fuels, the economic cost of healthcare associated with air pollution, the economic cost of oil spills, of burst pipelines, all those things, you're looking at closer to $2 trillion a year, right? That's a huge tip in the scales towards fossil fuels. And the last obstacle is the need for social acceptance. By a show of hands, how many of you have ever seen, and I mean seen like in person looking at it, the nuclear power plant that brings electricity to PI? Really? That's cool. How many of you have ever seen solar panels or wind turbines in PI? Right. And that's the whole point. Conventional power plants are what's called centralized. They're large, powerful power plants, but then they can be built far, far away from customers. So, you know, this is by the Hudson Bay, and it's bringing us the electricity. So, if I don't agree with nuclear power, but do I really worry about it? No, because it's not in my backyard. Renewable energy systems are at their most effective when they're very close to their clients, as close as your roof or your backyard. So there's a necessity to have public support before you're going to start building wind turbines. For those of you that have been in PI long enough, you know what happens when wind turbines are forced upon a community. It never works. Well, it always works because it's forced, but it's never happy. So social acceptance for renewable energy systems is very, very important. All of this to say, if you take into account the need for renewable energy systems, the uneven economic playing field, and the importance for social acceptance, you realize, yeah, we need good policies to support renewables. So I mentioned earlier that I had 3 research questions. The first research question, which has to do with policy, right, that was just reading, a lot of reading, and writing up what the policies were that I found. For the second question about how the transition happened, I had the wonderful experience, of going to Denmark, of meeting folks in Samsø, and asking them questions and doing interviews. And that's how I was able to answer question 2. For question 3, about connecting those 2 things, it was just a matter of taking all the information and making connections. So, we're going to start with Danish energy policy, but first, we got to talk a little bit about the Danish government. Feel free to correct me if I make a mistake. This lady in the front is from Denmark. Denmark is a constitutional monarchy, which I guess is really similar to, are we technically a constitutional monarchy, or is England?
Yeah, similar,
Similar, yeah. So their monarch is a title head, they're not involved in politics. And the rest of the government, there's a parliament, a government, and there's the courts. Like Canada, they're a multi-party structure. Man, I forgot you're from Denmark. I'm so bad. It's a multi-party structure, but unlike Canada, they don't have first past the post. They have a proportional system. And as a result, it's almost impossible to get a majority government. They haven't seen a majority government since 1909. Now, in Canadian politics, coalition is a dirty word. In Denmark, it's just the norm. And what it means is that you can't pass a law in Denmark unless you've got the support of at least one other party, which means you can think long term, right? You're not worried about your law being destroyed by the next government that gets elected in 4 years. So they're able to think long term, which is what they've done with their energy policy. From the 1970s to the beginning of the transition in 1997, the Danish government put out 4 different energy policy documents, which were basically ways for the government to share what the direction the government is going when it comes to energy. The first one was produced in 1976, and that was in reaction to the energy crisis of 73 and 74, when oil prices around the world skyrocketed. At the time, Denmark's energy consumption was 90% imported oil. So they weren't too excited when prices skyrocketed. So their focus on their first energy policy plan was to reduce their dependence on imported oil. And they were going to do that by moving from oil to coal temporarily, with a long-term plan of moving to nuclear power. Having said that, if you read the policy document, because you know, who doesn't read Danish policy documents from the 1970s? There was a long-term plan and a long-term look at renewables. And they realized that, you know, oil is going to run out, nuclear power is going to run out, we're going to have renewables at some point. So even in the 1970s, there was funding for R&D in renewables. Fast forward 5 years, pretty much more of the same. Let's reduce our dependence on imported oil, let's develop nuclear. However, that didn't go over well with the Danes. Apparently there was a lot of pushback on the government, there was a lot of objection to nuclear power, and by 1985, the idea of nuclear power was removed from the plans, and there was a stronger push towards renewable energy. Fast forward to 1990, and we start seeing a real focus on sustainability into the energy sector. Denmark was the first nation in the world in 1990 to set a target for carbon emissions reductions, which is amazing. And they also had good targets for wind energy production. Fast forward another 6 years, and this is the energy plan that matters the most to the transition that we're here to talk about, well, that I'm here to talk about. Again, more of the same, more ambitious targets for CO2 emissions reductions, more ambitious for targets for wind energy and for renewable energy in general. So that's kind of the motivation, right? It wasn't, I feel as though we think about Denmark and we think, oh, they're so environmentally conscious, and it was a progression. It was a gradual move initially for energy independence, and gradually moved into, hey, let's do this sustainably. Now, if you dig deeper into the more specifics, there's 3 big things that stood out for me when it comes to energy policy. The first was energy efficiency. So if we're going to use energy, let's use it as efficiently as possible. And that was a big part of the energy plans, even starting in 1976. A focus on the efficiency of power plants, the appliances in our homes, and our buildings as well. In fact, and this I found amazing, the first energy requirements for new buildings in Denmark was released in 1961. That's pretty amazing. And over time, those standards were tightened and tightened to the point that from 1990 to 2009, Danish energy consumption was pretty much flat, while the economy increased by 79% and CO2 emissions were reduced. That's pretty amazing. At least I think that's pretty amazing. So energy efficiency is one big part of policy. The other part was support for wind energy. That support was pretty constant since the 1970s, which is again kind of a first around the world, a country that has constant support for renewables for a long period of time. But interestingly, there was a focus on consumer participation. In other words, they wanted the people of Denmark to invest and to participate in the deployment of renewable energy. And they did that in a variety of ways. One, they mandated that utilities purchase wind energy. So if you put a wind turbine in your backyard, the utilities has to buy that power. Not only that, but they mandated that the utilities upgrade the power grid as needed as more and more wind was developed. And I would say the key policy, and this is going to come up again, is the feed-in tariff. A feed-in tariff is actually not a subsidy. A feed-in tariff is a rule that says to the utilities, you have to pay X amount of money for electricity from renewable sources. So what it does is it guarantees the person that builds a wind turbine, it guarantees how much money they're going to get for their electricity. In addition to that, to make it even more enticing, the government added an actual subsidy, an additional tariff. They called it something like a sustainable energy tariff. And on top of that, income from wind energy was actually taxed at a lower rate than regular income. So everything to get people on board and investing in wind. And last but not least, taxation, which is another bad word. The Danish government used taxation on the one hand to discourage the use of fossil fuels, but on the other hand to encourage efficiency and conservation, but also to make alternative energy sources seem more appealing financially. First energy taxes came in 1977, and from 1977 to 2002, we have other taxes on coal, on CO2, natural gas, sulfur, electricity. By 2002, which is basically in the middle of the transition, the effective tax rate on energy products was 200%. When I was in Denmark in 2015, gas prices here were about $1. Gas prices in Denmark were between $2.25 and $2.50 a liter. So, very high tax rate on energy.
You said you're taxing the energy taxes on oil and electricity, or you're taxing the oil or taxing the electricity in 1977 there?
Both, oil and electricity.
Why would you tax the electricity if you want them to use it?
They don't want them to use it. The focus is to reduce consumption.
They use electricity.
Yes.
Is that not in their...
But if it's taxed a lot, people will use it less. Now, keep in mind, this is 1977. I'm giving you my best guess as to, like, 1977 is a long time ago, but I didn't actually read that part of it. This is based on the research that I did.
Okay, no, I thought you were just trying to deter the oil and increase electricity production. And
no, they're trying to deter everything. Like they're trying to deter consumption as a whole, to push efficiency and to encourage
reduction.
Yeah. But yeah, I see. I understand I understand your point. But yeah, as far as I can tell, there was an oil on tax and separately an oil on sorry. What did I just say?
Tax on oil.
I do that a lot. A tax on oil and a tax on electricity separately.
Okay.
So to summarize, Danish energy policy, there's an explicit policy that says we are moving away from fossil fuels. There's a focus on energy efficiency. There is support for wind energy and other renewables. and there is taxation on energy. And that's kind of the policy framework within which this transition to renewables happened. This is where we get to the fun stuff. So the implementation itself, the transition itself. Interestingly, it didn't happen out of nowhere. In the 1996 Energy Plan, the government actually introduced this idea of selecting a renewable energy island. The idea was to create a competition where one island would be chosen as a showcase to illustrate the feasibility of a move to renewable energy. They had the competition, oh sorry, I forgot something. There was going to be no new subsidies, no grants, nothing special. It's just, you're the island, get to work. For the community of Samsø, did you guys, any of you, and a friend of mine brought this up, any of you, I'm sure you don't, but any of you use Netflix? There's a documentary, what's it called? Islands of the Future, which actually talks about Samsø. You guys might want to check that out. So the competition was seen by the community of Samsø as an opportunity. Like many small communities, even in Canada, but also in Denmark, with automation and globalization, they were seeing jobs leave the island gradually, and there were actual genuine fears for the loss of the sustainability of the community. So this was seen as a wonderful opportunity for them. And in 1997, they had the competition, and they won. Yay! Now the work begins. So the first thing they needed was a master plan, and the expression master plan is a term that was used again and again in my interviews that people brought up. The master plan had a lot of parts to it. One of them was looking at how do people in Samsø use energy, and how can we change the way that they use energy? Also, what are the different sources of energy that are present in Samsø that we could use to replace fossil fuels? And the master plan was extremely important because it was a guide, it was a recipe, it was something that the community could follow step by step in their transition away from fossil fuels. And most importantly, it had no new technology, it had no crazy ideas, it was something that was feasible, that was possible, which was important. Because if you come to people and you say, I have this grand idea and look at all these crazy things we're going to do, people aren't going to buy it. But if you tell them, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it makes it much easier for people to go, yeah, we can do that. So once they've got the plan, now they need a leader. The community of Samsø, the local government, created a position called the Island Project Leader, or IPL, which was, as the name entails, basically the leader of the transition, the guy in charge. And that's the man. Some of you may recognize the face. He's pretty world famous, not in a like Matthew McConaughey world famous, but if you follow energy issues, especially sustainable energy issues, you've probably heard of Søren Hermansen. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. He was the lead of the transition, and in his words, his job was to work bottom up to communicate, to engage, and to activate projects. In other words, his job was to work with the community, with the people of Samsø, and to get them on board, and to get projects moving along. So we got a plan, we got a leader, now we need the community. To do that, the IPL, the Island Project Leader, went out and found some important folks in the different communities, the small communities of Samsø, people that were well known, that were respected, and he got them on board. And then the hope was to have kind of a snowball effect. Like a few people are on board, and they talk to a bunch of other people, and they get them on board, and then on and on and on and on. And it was all about communication. They used the radio, they used the newspapers, they had a website, they went door to door, they had a bunch of public meetings where they got people to come in. They literally sat in circles. Now obviously that's easy to do when you have a very small community, but the idea was if you're all sitting in a circle, everybody's equal, everybody can have their say, but also nobody can like sit in the back row and go, this sucks, right? Because everyone's going to see everybody else talking. And these conversations continued throughout the transition, from 1997 to 2007, keeping people, not only keeping them up to date, but getting their input and getting their feedback. Because as we're going to see later, These people aren't just giving their say, they're spending their money. And of course, as you would imagine, there was some skepticism, some concerns, and very valid ones. Some people were just afraid of change, and they had just negative opinions. I love this. When someone told me this, it made me laugh. This was from one of my interviews. Some people thought it was just an idea for green idiots. In other words, for like environmentalists. Some people, and you've probably heard this in PI, oh, the wind turbines are going to ruin the landscape, and it's going to ruin our tourism. And some people had concerns about the impact on electricity and on heating prices. All valid concerns. But despite those concerns, support for this project grew like a disease. This was, again, another quote from the people that I talked to. And as they hoped, a small number of people were on board, and they got more people on board, and they got more people on board, and more people on board, and then off it went. And this was an interesting story that someone told me. A lot of people, and maybe some people in this room, opposed the idea of subsidies, right? For a political or an economic, like, what's the word? Thank you. But even those people ended up investing in wind turbines and taking advantage of those subsidies that they don't like. So we've got the plan, we've got the leader, we've got the community. Let's get to work. But interestingly, the first thing they did, once they got the okay of the community, the first thing they did wasn't install a whole bunch of wind turbines. The first thing they did is they worked on efficiency and energy conservation. Right? Because if you can bring down the community's energy consumption, you need less wind turbines, you need less solar panels, and it's going to cost you less. So that's what they did. And the other interesting thing, the other way that they got people on board with the idea of energy efficiency is that when your electricity and your heating oil is taxed at 200%, your payback period on new windows or better insulation is pretty quick. So the first role of the island project leader was actually educating households, literally going door to door and talking with families and with individuals and saying, okay, well, have you considered, closing this door and turning down the heat in there? What are different ways that people could save on heating and on electricity? And it's amazing. The pictures that you're going to see, those are pictures from when I was down there in 2015. Most of these are very old homes. Like they're all brick houses, and some of them date back to the 1800s. But if you look closely, they all have new and modern windows and doors. Now, they didn't all have that, right? I'm cherry picking. But it was amazing walking around in this community with all these old buildings, and almost all of them had brand new windows and doors. And from what people were telling me, all those renovations date back to 97 at the latest. So once they got that done, or rather kind of in sequence, then they got to work with the renewable energy systems. It's very similar to PI. Most of the heating done in Samsø was done by heat. And the decision that was made was to replace that by district heating plants. Think of a small power plant whose job, actually PEI Energy Systems by the Hillsborough Bridge, kind of the same thing. So it's a power plant that will burn either wood chips from sustainably harvested wood, harvested on the island, or agricultural waste. You burn that, and the heat that you produce, you literally pipe to people's homes. And the homes that were too far from district plants to be connected would be encouraged to go to like heat pumps and things of the sort. For electricity, which originally was brought in from coal-fired plants off-island, the plan was to move to wind energy. And a little bit of solar, but most of it was wind. This is a map of Samsø. And just to give you a sense of scale, from here to here is about 35 kilometers. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H are all renewable energy sites. A is a district heating plant. C, I don't know these by heart. C, D, and E are other district heating plants. B has 3 turbines, F has 5, G has 3, and H is 10 offshore wind turbines. So you have wind turbines and district heating plants. These were all built in that 10-year period. But what is most interesting about this, and I have to use my notes because I don't remember this by heart. The great thing about this system was not just the systems themselves, was the fact that they were all owned in different ways. Like, they weren't all owned by a big corporation, or they weren't all owned by co-ops. There was different ways, different schemes of ownership. Of the 11 onshore turbines, 2 were owned by local co-ops, which had 10% of the population of the island in the co-ops. And 9 were owned by local farmers. Of the 4 district heating plants, 2 were owned by utilities. 1 was owned by a local businessman, and another one was owned by the actual customers of the district plant. And of the 10 offshore wind turbines, 5 were owned by the local government, 3 were owned by off-island investors, and 2 were also owned by co-ops. So, not to sound like socialist or anything, but they were spreading the wealth around. Everyone had an opportunity to invest. So, kind of in summary, the transition took 10 years. There was constant communication with the people and involvement with the people of Samsø, and they were following a master plan every step of the way. Which brings us to making connections between Danish policies and the transition. Interestingly, for the most part, for the people of Samsø and the people that I spoke to, of all the people I spoke to, I think only one of them was like, yeah, it was all about the environment. Everybody else, the environmental considerations were secondary. The primary motivation for people getting involved in this was economic. It had to make sense financially. As one of my interviewees said, you have to convince people that this is a good idea, and you will actually either save or earn money doing it. So the Danish policies that were in place made this transition economically profitable in 3 ways. First, supporting public participation, and then what I like to call the stick and the carrot. Did I actually write that in my thesis? Stick and carrot? I think so. So the stick, which was taxation, and the carrot, which was the feed-in tariff. So why public participation? Why is that important? And how did they do it? Well, by guaranteeing grid connection, and by making it easy to connect to the grid, and by guaranteeing the purchase of electricity, you're making it easy for people to get on board. But not only that, policies were in place to support cooperative ownership of renewable energy systems. Right? Not everybody has $1 million to buy a turbine, but a lot more people can find $650 to invest. That was the cost of 1 share in a wind turbine, in a co-op, excuse me. And actually the most common, you could buy 1, 2, 3, 5, 100, but the most common apparently was 7. Because if you bought 7 shares, that was the equivalent in terms of electricity production to the consumption of a family. So if you bought 7 shares, you could say that, that you're sustainable, your energy consumption is sustainable. And like I said earlier, more than 10% of the population ended up investing in turbines. And because people could participate, because people can be involved both in the decision making and in the economic side of it, there was public acceptance and concerns completely disappeared. Well, no, I shouldn't say completely, but for the most part. In the 10 years of the transition, 58 million euros were invested. I'm sorry I didn't take the time to convert that into dollars. I honestly didn't think about it. 70% of that 58 million euro was invested by local residents. And Samsø is a small scale version of PI. Like, yeah, there's a few rich folks, but it's just people like, us. It's not a particularly rich community that all had a bunch of money to spend, is what I'm trying to say. And when it comes to taxation, with an effective tax rate of 200% on heating oil and electricity, it makes alternatives look really interesting. Not only that, but when they got people to get on board with the district heating plan, they guaranteed on paper that their cost of heating would be lower with the district heating plan than with heating oil. And with a tax rate of 200% on heating oil, it's not hard to do. Well, not as hard. It also discouraged the waste of energy, it encouraged efficiency, it encouraged conservation, and it also made investments in things like windows and insulation. It made those things much shorter to pay back. One gentleman that I spoke to said, every investment he and his family, made paid for itself within 5 years. So what he'd do is he'd make an investment, and then as he saw the money coming back in, he'd invest in another thing. He ended up investing like $70,000, so he's out of the average. Like he ended up like putting a wind turbine in his backyard. He was an electrician, so he had to know how to do some of these things. But I have a friend who would do that. And finally, the feed-in tariff, right? The encouragement, the carrot to get people on board. This was critical. Like everyone I spoke to said, if you didn't have the feed-in tariff, this would have never worked. And there's two important characteristics of the feed-in tariff that were critical. Its duration and its value. It's a set policy that was guaranteed to be in place for X number of years. And its value was set also for that same period of time. What that did is it made it incredibly easy to get a loan. Like, people would talk to me about how you could go to a bank and say, yeah, I'd like to borrow $10,000, I want to invest in a co-op. And the banks had no problems because they knew this policy came from the national government. It was a set policy. So they knew that they were going to get their money back. Payback period on investments in wind turbines was between 4 and 7 years, depending on how many, if you bought a whole turbine or if you invested in shares. So if you've got a wind turbine with a lifespan of 25 to 30 years, and your payback period is 4 years, that's, 20, 25 years of profit. I came across this quote when I was doing my research, and I think that it summarizes in a way why this transition in Samsø worked. It's easier to accept some extra noise and the view of a turbine if it reminds you of the fact that the turbine gives you money when the wind blows. And it's true. And this was a quote in 2007. It's from stuff that happened in other parts of the world, but it's the same all over the place. So, we get to the policy recommendation part. What I'm going to suggest here is mostly based on what I saw in Samsø, but also supported by the research that I did in energy policy from other places as well. The important thing to note is PEI can't just take what happened in Samsø and do exactly the same thing. We're bigger, we have a bigger population, we have different relationships with offshore energy, a lot of different reasons. What we can do is we can learn from their lesson, from what they've done, and apply that to our system.
What is the population of Samsø?
At the time of the transition, it was 4,200 people. Yeah, it's very small. I should have said that. I'm going to put that in my presentation next time. But again, there are lessons. First, we need a long-term energy policy. No offense to the people who are here from the government of PEI, but our energy and climate policies are vague at best. Right? We don't look like we have a direction. And what we need is we need to be able to say, we have an energy policy with a goal of moving off of fossil fuels and towards renewables. And we need a plan. If we want to transition away from fossil fuels, we need to be open to different ways, different systems of ownership for the different systems we're going to put in place. We need to be open to different types of energy systems. What will work better on the east end of the island? What will work better on the west end? What about geothermal? What about district heating plants? What about solar? What about wind? We need to be open to those things. And we need to do what's possible in the different parts of PEI. We need to do better on conservation and energy efficiency, which, as we talked about before, it'll bring down the cost of the transition, and more importantly, it'll save people money much sooner. We need to end subsidies. I don't know if you know, but your federal tax dollars and your provincial tax dollars still go to subsidizing fossil fuels. Some of it directly, some of it indirectly, but we still subsidize in Canada the fossil fuel industry. God knows why. Okay. And we need to levy taxes on carbon. Now, I'm listening to the politics around a carbon tax, both in PEI and around Canada, angers me to no end. Right? It seems like an uneducated conversation. We do not seem to understand the threat that we have with climate change and how urgently we need to act. And when I hear governments like Ontario and Alberta talking about suing the federal government, you should sue them because they're not doing enough. But anyways, that's my pedestal. And we need to have an emphasis on consumer participation and consumer engagement. We need to get the people of PEI involved in this. We can't just bring in people from off island and say, hey, we're going to put a wind turbine right over there. No, people in PEI need to be part of this. which means we need to work on education. We need to be open to various ownership schemes, including cooperatives, and we need a feed-in tariff, right? I'm in the process of building a new home, and so I've looked at like subsidies and whatnot. And, if I'm not mistaken, the best you can do with a solar panel is you can get you can have savings on your electricity bill. That's not enough. We need to encourage people. We need to make it financially profitable to put solar panels on your roof or to put wind turbines in your backyard. And that tariff needs to be steady over many years, and it has to be generous. Basically, if you take all that and put it together, it has to make economic sense for us to do this. The gist of my thesis and the gist of this presentation has been kind of why we have to do it, right? Why this is important. But I'd like to finish in a different direction and make an argument of why we should do it no matter what. Like even if climate change wasn't involved, even if we didn't have a responsibility to reduce our emissions, I'd like to finish by trying to make the argument that it would just be a good idea to make a good transition to renewable energy and a good idea for PEI. And I'm going to go back to Samsø for that. Because one of the side effects in Samsø of this transition, well, there were a lot of side effects, and a lot of them were very, very positive. First of all, the Renewable Energy Island is now known around the world, and I'm not exaggerating. There are around 5,000 people a year, journalists, scholars, scientists, researchers like myself, who come to Samsø and who go specifically to this building, this is the Energy Academy, to learn about what they've done and try to bring that experience back to their country. And beyond those 5,000 people, not only were tourists scared off by the wind turbines, they're coming just for the wind turbines. The same way people come to PEI because it's Anne's land, people go to Samsø because it's the Energy Island, the Renewable Energy Island. So tourism is up. The name Samsø is now a brand all unto itself. There's a positive connotation associated with that name. So when you see people like with Samsø vegetables in Europe, they're like, yes, Samsø. It's literally a brand now. And the investments that people made not only became profits, but they became jobs. They worked very hard to make sure that the people putting up the turbines and the panels and who were putting in new windows were island folks, were people from Samsø. And the profits that the local government made, because remember the local government owned 5 wind turbines, offshore wind turbines. The profits from that were reinvested into the community. This is a skateboarding park that I visited, which was very, like you can see, it's brand new construction, which is part of a larger park, which is across the street from a brand new community center, which is near a brand new dock. They own their own ferry. Imagine if Montague had its own ferry, right? This is all economic gains from the transition. And most of all is a sense of pride and optimism in the community, right? A community that thought it was on its way out now has a new sense of pride and a new sense of optimism, which is beautiful to see. So I would argue that not only do we have a responsibility to move aggressively to renewable energy, but we should do it because it would be awesome for PEI. And I'd like to leave you with a cartoon that I'll let you read, because I feel as though it illustrates my point in a kind of comical way. Can you guys read that in back? Do I need to read that for the folks back? So yeah, like energy independence, preservation of rainforest, sustainability, green jobs, blah, blah, blah. What if it's a hoax? It's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing. That's kind of the situation we're in, right? Imagine if instead of sending the money that we spend for energy off island, we just send it to our neighbor who's making the electricity we're buying, what that would do. If we could hire a bunch of people to put up solar panels and improve the insulation in buildings. And there's a lot of positive that could come from this, and I think it's, not only do we have a responsibility to do it, I think it would be great for PEI. And that's it.
questions and comments? Yes.
I'm just wondering, when you said Samso was chosen as the island,
Yeah.
are there other following?
No.
Why?
Because the whole point of the competition was to illustrate that it's possible, right? To say, let's pick a spot, let's pick one spot, basically like let's have a lab and do our little experiment and show that it's possible. And now it's been done. And the national, I don't know if they call it a federal or a national government, anyways, the government of Denmark, they're not sitting on this. Like the country as a whole is moving aggressively forward with in their goal for sustainability. So I think that the island played its role. There isn't really a need to do it again because they're trying to do it at the national scale now.
And are they?
They're doing better than everybody else. If the whole world was moving ahead as fast as Denmark, we'd have a much better chance of meeting our 2-degree target. That's for sure. We done?
I have read and heard that wind turbines could be dangerous for the birds.
True.
Because they have found defined renewable feathers.
Yep.
For wind turbines and also for the insects. So, and because of we see a rapid extinction of animals.
Would you speak louder?
No, I'll repeat after. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So, yeah, I'm just worried about this technology and is it safe and is there other ways to make sure?
Yeah. So the question was basically that there are and there have been and there continues to be concerns about wind turbines and the dangers to birds, dangers to insects. Although I had never heard about insects. That's interesting. And that is a concern. That is certainly something that we have to keep in mind. And there's been a lot of work done to mitigate. I can't talk to the insects because honestly I had never heard about that before, so I can't answer that part, but I can answer the bird part. Siting of wind turbines is really important, both for the wind but also for the birds. So if you know, for example, if there's a migratory route for a certain species of birds, don't put a wind turbine there. There have been improvements in design, wind turbines with sound generators to scare off birds and things of the sort. And it is a real concern, and it is true. Like, birds will get killed by wind turbines. What I find interesting is when you look at the stats, what is it, like house cats kill like 2 billion birds a year, and wind turbines kill about 50,000 birds a year. So it's not something that we should ignore. It is not. Like, if your purpose is to build this more sustainable planet, you're not going to do it by killing a bunch of animals, right? It doesn't make sense. But there are definitely ways to minimize those dangers, and I'm going to look into the insects because I had never heard about that before. Interestingly though, with offshore wind turbines, they actually found it's amazing for biodiversity. Because when you start putting a bunch of wind turbines in the water, A, it reduces boat traffic because boats don't like to go around the turbines. And also it creates a bunch of structures where, I'm not good with my plant biology, where a bunch of stuff can start, building on top of it. Corals and all those lovely things. So they've actually found that biodiversity in the water around offshore wind turbines actually increases, which is cool.
And also, I'm wondering about the underground electric wires to prevent flooding.
What about them?
Well, I've read a little bit about maybe the necessity to have the electric wires underground.
Yep.
That we don't need to cut trees.
Yeah, well, underground wires would be amazing. I think it's something that we should do in PEI. Anyways, like how many times do we lose power because the power lines go down? Actually that was the interesting thing. You see very little above ground power lines on the island. All of it's underground. Yes.
So did you say they've got 100% renewable energy there?
I was hoping someone would say that. Okay, so I had to cut. Like I was going to keep you guys here for like 3 hours if I had my way. So the initial plan in 1997 was to go completely sustainable, get rid of all fossil fuels, including cars, tractors, boats, everything. What they realized as the years came on, as the project came along, the technology especially for automobiles, for boats, for tractors, it just wasn't there yet. So what they did, the offshore wind farm, the 10 offshore wind turbines were actually to offset their emissions from cars, boats, and planes, and cars, boats, and tractors. So they were carbon neutral, is what they were. Having said that, they haven't stopped. Their goal is to be completely fossil-free by 2030. So they weren't technically 100% fossil fuel free, but they were carbon neutral. But by 2030, everything should run on either electricity or biogas, because what they're planning on doing is actually building a biogas plant. So take their food waste and put it in this gigantic thing, and the gas that they would produce, they could use as basically like an alternative for diesel. And their ferry, they're planning on running their ferry on that too.
So their district heating plants, do they get all the fuel from the island?
Yeah. One of them is part solar. It's like solar heat, and wood chips from a forest nearby, which is sustainably harvested. And the other ones are straw, which is just basically agricultural waste.
So how big is the island?
144 square kilometers, if I remember my stats correctly. It's about 35 kilometers by like 10 kilometers wide.
Acreage-wise, no.
What's that?
Acreage-wise.
I have no idea.
Size of Magdalen Islands.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. But more, like the Magdalens are kind of like spread out, like a lot of small bits.
Do they have a high-speed train?
No, they're way too.
Electric
But
buses?
they have a transit system. They have buses, which is cool. They have a population of 4,000 people and they have buses. That's awesome. But no high-speed train.
No, okay, it's a science, but electric. I drive a bus. I drive a school bus. And a school bus, I asked them what it costs. It's $125,000 to buy a diesel school bus. To buy an electric bus here, it costs $350,000.
Interesting. Minus the 5,000 we're going to get from the books.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things a few years ago, when government was doing a lot of cuts to teachers, I wrote something up. I had a conversation with not the education minister, but his second in command. And one of the things I suggested was that we transition our school buses to run on cooking oil, on used cooking oil, right? Which is a relatively simple conversion. And we're an island that grows potatoes and cooks potatoes, so we'd have an abundant supply of McDonald's, and all our buses would smell like fries. Obviously, they didn't do it, but yeah, no, there's definitely other ways that we could power our buses. Actually, there was a hand up here earlier.
Yeah. I was just wondering if you looked at the whole country and noticed that the garbage plants that burns garbage takes care of all the trash all over Denmark, not just there. And they don't just use the pellets and the straw, but they get rid of the garbage. And we could have done that here for the last 20 years and heated the whole place instead of carting the garbage up someplace else.
There's a few northern European countries that are really big into that, the burning of garbage. Like she was saying, how in Denmark they burn a lot of their garbage for heat. Obviously, you have to be careful with that. You have to have a really good system of filters, because you can get some pretty toxic, nasty stuff coming out of burning waste. But if it's done properly, yeah, it's an interest. I think it was Sweden or Finland that's like buying other countries' garbage so that they can burn it. So yeah, we do it at PEI Energy Systems on a very small scale, but we do it good. Yes, sir.
Well, kind of one of the most interesting things about Denmark is that, as you mentioned, for 10 years they have had 70% growth in the economy without any growth, or actually a reduction in CO2, which is totally unlike Canada, where everything seems to go up together. The only time it slows down is when the economy.
Yeah, we often hear that argument that, oh, we can't reduce our emissions.
Which is totally untrue.
Which is not only is not only is it totally untrue, but it's like, okay, so what? We're just going to let the planet warm and ruin our system just because you say that we can't do it? Like, yeah, it's possible, and we just have to make changes. Sir?
Yeah, just as an aside, first, for a number of years, I had a diesel pickup truck and a restaurant.
Cool.
Oil.
Yep.
And the only thing I had to do to the truck was I put on a marine oil filter that separated oil or water that condensed in the oil, and ran fine.
Nice.
Even in the winter, it was great. But I wanted to comment on some of the things you mentioned here. First off, I was really encouraged that you started the talk by saying how we really can't leave this up to market forces, that we need good, strong policy that would be effective. And I was also encouraged that you emphasized the need for public ownership of these utilities. The whole focus really changes from making a profit to doing good when it's publicly owned. I'm a little bit concerned about the carrot-stick option. Okay? Especially what we see in Canada is we're being hit with a stick without any carrot.
Yeah.
You know, the carbon tax is being forced upon us, but it's not being balanced with incentives to do the kind of things that you were describing here that work so well. So there's another idea as well, and look back to, been reading about what Roosevelt did in implementing the New Deal, because a lot of the newly elected progressives are talking about a Green New Deal in the United States.
Yeah.
And Roosevelt took the United States out of depression without raising taxes. What he did is he created the Reconstruction Investment Fund. And so he took public investment, put it into this fund in order to rebuild America. And then he lent that money to borrowers who were able to do projects that were approved by government as being sound investments to grow the economy. And so the investors won because they made money. The government won because it made money reloaning the money and investing whatever it made into projects. And the borrowers made money because they saved, in this case, borrowers could win by saving on their energy costs. And of course, the planet wins by reducing our carbon footprint. So, you know, an investment fund like that could be the necessary type of carrot,
Right.
Which would make it the carbon tax a lot more acceptable. But right now, I don't know how much we pay in taxes right now, but you know, I mean, I'm sure you realize that there's a really controversial issue right now.
Yep.
Because nobody sees the incentive.
Well, I'm not to speak on behalf of the Green Party, but unless it's changed, are you guys still talking about fee and dividend? Right. There's a lot of different ways for a carbon tax to work. The way that the Green Party suggests, which is actually the one that makes the most sense, and the one that is actually supported by a lot of climate scientists, it's called the fee and dividend. So basically, what you do is you tax fossil fuels at the source. So for a place like PI, you would, because we don't actually produce our own fossil fuels, you tax them when they come in. So you tax, let's say, gasoline when it comes into PI. You take all that income, and what you do is you send it back to the population. So every tax-paying individual gets an even share. And what that does is you get the market signal, because obviously the oil company is going to pass that on to its customers. So you see the market signal because fossil fuels become more expensive, but everybody gets a check back on a regular basis. So, and what the economic studies have shown is that if you do something like that, the people that are at the lowest end of the economic scale, they actually make more money from the checks than it will cost them extra because of the tax. The people that are, middle class, give or take, and the people that lose the most money are the people that are the richest, because they're the ones that tend to consume the most. That's an interesting way, I find, that would be the most, not only the most effective, but I find the most palatable way of introducing a carbon tax.
But it's leaving it to the market to decide what changes we're going to make, right?
Yeah.
All we're doing is turning over more money, right?
Well,
instead of coming up with
part of it, well, when you put a 200% tax on energy, you're also using the market. Like, we are still a market economy, so you want to use that to your advantage when you can. But what it'll do is it'll make people think about their choices, and it'll probably force manufacturers also to adjust their way. Like, if you saw a carbon tax overnight, you know, I remember when, just before the economic recession hit, when gas was like $1.40, everybody was selling their trucks and their SUVs and their minivans. People can react really quickly to an increase in cost. But anyways.
I think George had his hand up too.
Just a simple question. What's the main economy on the island?
Very similar to PI. Tourism, farming, fishing, those are the big ones. And they grow potatoes. Potatoes, a lot. Although their potato farms are kind of funny because they don't have like evenly spread out rows. They have 2 rows space. 2 rows space. I don't know why. I wanted to bring that up. But yeah, it's actually very similar to what's happening to the economy of PI in a more general sense.
But it's very interesting how the local people invest in all these things. I mean, we have windmills here. We're not doing too badly, but who knows who even owns them? I mean,
That's the thing.
I don't know if it's like some kind of giant thing. Yeah. Everybody has its share in their windmill.
I think we're going to take a pause because I think these folks want to finish, and some of you would probably need to leave. But if some of you want to keep talking and asking questions, feel free. Before you leave, if anybody wants a copy of this, or if anybody is interested in reading the long thesis, feel free to come and give me your name, and I'll find a way, or your email address, and I can send that out to you. But I think that we're...
Well, I thank you so much.
So I'm staying if you guys have other questions and want to talk.
And it's funny, potato bag. Yay! No potatoes in it. Sorry, Jocelyn. No, we have books. Books for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was an absolute... so wonderful to hear the kinds of research that our students are doing, and I had met Joss when he was 2 or 3 years into his program, and so to see him at the end and to be able to entertain us and educate us at the same time, and doing what the Institute of Island Studies was meant to do, was to bring look at Prince Edward Island through the lens of other islands, and this is exactly what you've done. We might not necessarily go for best practices, but best fit. And if we can find things in this that will fit Prince Edward Island, then I think we've done our job. Jim, you wanted to say something?
Just a couple of things just to follow up on you, Joss. You can see we're videoing this. We upload these to our own Institute of Island Studies website after it's done, so you can see it there. And Joss's thesis and all of the other graduates of the master's program, they're also on our website. If you go to the link on the Master of Arts Island Studies website, it says theses. Every one of the theses is a link there, so you can just click on the link beside Joss's name and his thesis will come up.
Website islandstudies.com, or if you need to reach me, just IIS, Institute of Island Studies at upei.ca, or Brinklow at upei.ca. So we have our newsletter. You'll see opportunities that come up from time to time, really good lectures that we put on, public symposia, a book launch coming up, Jane Ledwell's new book, Return of the Wild Geese, Thursday, April 4th, 7 p.m. at Beaconsfield. And so this, as I mentioned, is the last lecture of this series. We'll resume in October, looking for ideas. So again, IIS at upei.ca. Thank you, Carolyn, for this idea. It was terrific. I see Brenda Whiteway in the audience. We're talking about an idea for a lecture in the fall, and very much looking forward to seeing you all again. So again, thank you very much for coming out, and thank you, Joss.
Thank you.
Yeah.